Hey, how are
All
things
good.
on the West Coast?
Great. It's still dark out, so that's normal.
How many of
How about
these
you?
do you do on a typical day, Chris?
I'm sorry?
I say, how many of these podcasts do you do on a typical day?
Well, today's a little special. I'm doing 3 today, but usually it's a dull roar of 1.
Okay, okay, cool.
Yeah, my apologies for last week. Something just came up and it just I was not able to make it happen. So apologies.
I totally get it. No worries. You are in good company. With everything going on, personal surprises seems to be something of a norm.
Exactly. Wow, your room was very similar to color scheme to mine. I'm like, wow.
That's good. That's good. You know, I suppose we could. I suppose we could. I could change it to a dark shirt, and then we could have your viewers thinking, "Wait a minute, did they plan this?"
Who are these people? I love it. All right.
Okay,
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about? We'll go from there.
terrific. Well, Peter Mulford. I'm the head of our innovation and digital transformation practice at BTS, and what I'm most passionate about. What a lovely question. I'm I've been very curious for a long time about creativity, really what it is, how it works, and how people can use it once you have an understanding of what it is and how it works to make their lives better. And specifically to BTS, how you can use it to discover and solve problems in new ways. And I would say more recently, maybe in the last 2 years, this has included also using creativity to help you become comfortable with uncertainty, right? To see uncertainty not as something to be avoided, but actually something that can be the source of inspiration and, practically speaking, growth and profitability for a business.
Well, that's interesting because I feel the same way. I think uncertainty is life, basically. I mean, and it's like if you
Uh,
fear uncertainty, you're gonna fear life because uncertainty. Yeah, it's like one of the things that I love is that when I'm doing project after project, and then people are always talking about this mythical thing called the steady state, right? That
mm,
you go through the project, and at the end, there's a steady state, and I'm like,
right.
what steady state? There's no such thing as a steady state anymore. In fact, was there ever a steady state, right?
But you know what? So it's interesting you say that, Chris, because I'm guessing that you and I are probably similar in age. And if you look at the things that we were taught and that most leaders our age were taught, particularly in the business domain, right? You largely had a set of management principles and tools that were designed to build an advantage and scale an advantage over time. That
Yep.
was the whole thing, right? So it's no surprise that there's a bias towards uncertainty
Hmm.
in most companies because largely all of the tools that we were taught in business school were about how you strip uncertainty out of any kind of situation to improve the probability of your forecasts being accurate, which then drove your budget cycles, which then drove your hiring and your capex and everything else. And now we find ourselves in a world where periods of competitive advantage are simply getting so short that a lot of these tools fall apart. But the bias is still there. The
Exactly.
bias is still there. This intuition about let's get to the steady state and scale is bumping up against the reality, which is it's not there anymore. And I think a lot of firms are finding the tools they have for dealing the environment don't work anymore as a result.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this. I think the other thing that we're taught, and I don't know if it's the same for you, is the importance of planning. Right? It's so important to plan. But the reality is that every plan is a disaster because
Right, right.
within moments it's gone. Right? And we haven't really what we really need to do is plan for resilience, right? To bounce back from these things that are going to happen because we know that they're going to happen. We just don't know when, and we don't know how severe they are. But if we can build some kind of resilience against them, then we'll keep going. So we can't plan too far. Otherwise, our plans are worth nothing.
It's that's an interesting way. That's an interesting way of putting it. I have found, and I'm curious to see if this is consistent with what you've discovered as well as you've done research for your books, that there is a shift taking place from planning and waiting as the norm to this idea of testing and learning. So a shift from planning and waiting to testing and learning, which is a hard one, especially for those of us who have been told really from elementary school on up, plan thoughtfully. Have you planned everything out? And that's a hard shift to make. Is that have you seen anything similar in your work?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, if you think about it, that's exactly where agile software development, design thinking, all those types of things that we're seeing sort of crop up in our world are from that, especially agile software development. I mean, agile software development is like, well, I got a general idea of what I want this thing to do, so let me start working on it. And then as we keep, continuously work on it and iterate, then what comes out of the end might be completely different. But you definitely have a very light plan before you go into that, and you use a lot of what's happening in the world to inform where you're going to go and pivot and et cetera. So, I mean, a lot, and it's not just in the software development world. I think that sort of thinking has really sort of infected other areas as well, and people are looking at things in a more agile way.
Yeah, and that last point about it creeping outside of the software world to almost, well, you could say, basically, I found it creeps out of the software world into any domain where you have more unknowns than knowns in any kind of project, which is to say, we find that I often get asked the question, okay, Peter and BTS, we get it, we understand that Agile is a thing. We understand that smart experimentation is a thing. But how do I decide from moment to moment whether I should be using smart experimentation or best practice sharing to go forward with a particular project? And what we found is the answer is actually relatively simple. It's if there are, say, 10 things you need to do in order to execute a particular project, and 7 of them are known to you and 3 are unknowns. Well, you don't really need Agile in that case. In that case, you can just leverage the knowledge you have, pull out your waterfall chart, your Gantt charts, and execute. It's in those circumstances where that ratio is flipped that you have to think differently. If there are 10 things I need to do, and only 1 of them is known to me, and 9 of them have a high degree of uncertainty, that's your signal that you need to manage it differently, and off you go.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, agile is so broadly used as a term. If you go and look at the real core tenets of agile project management, agile software development, none of that stuff is being used. Like, and when you talk about Scrum and et cetera, like, oh, we're having a daily stand-up, which you're sitting down for and doing for an hour. It's like,
yeah. Well, I think what you're getting at is something that certainly we feel a lot in the consulting world, which I think could be variously described as a buzzword bingo, right? There are a lot of terms that we deal with that well-intended consultants like ourselves put out into the world, which are confusing, like innovation and digital, and in this case, agile. So I would say, and I imagine you would agree with this, that the first step to getting any of this right is to create clarity around what you mean. So I would, from my experience from an innovation perspective, it's if you're going to do innovation, it means as a leadership team defining, well, what do we mean by this? And specifically, where do we want to see innovation and to what end? And similarly for digital and digital transformation, again, it starts with, okay, well, what are the business problems we're trying to solve? How do they map to the P&L for which we think the application of digital technology of any sort is a solution? So it always starts with business outcomes and then ladders back to, this term, whether it's agile or innovation or digital transformation, that is very clearly defined as solving a certain type of problem in a certain way using design thinking or using fast experimentation or using transition to the cloud or machine learning, etc. So start by creating clarity. Yeah.
Yeah, innovation as a term means so many different things to so many different people. You know, client A, client B, client C. It's all completely different. I mean, you have, say, a financial services client, you know, a traditional bank. Innovation is, oh, we have an iPad app, you know, and then you have a fintech company, it's something completely different. You have a healthcare company, it's something completely different. And you have to constantly recalibrate, you know, once you enter into a new situation. What do these people, what does this group feel is innovative? Like, where do the edges lie? And then you have to sort of play in that space.
Well, we're really lucky. We get to work with a number of companies, for example, in the financial services space, with digital natives, with industrial manufacturers. And we found, I think, Chris, to your point, that the firms who get it right actually have a very clear definition about what they mean when they say innovation in the first place. And I would say that when you get past the complications of language, the best ones have a definition that more or less sounds something like a discipline or an approach to solving problems in new ways,
Mhm.
right? And then you can go from there into horizon 1, 2, or 3 innovation, which of course I'm sure your listeners know is incremental, adjacent, or blue sky innovation. But the great ones always start by saying, look, this is fundamentally about solving problems. And if you have a problem that's solved by an app, that is innovation. Or if you have a problem that's solved by machine learning or artificial intelligence, that's innovation. And the beautiful thing is, once there's clarity around what we mean, the allocation of resources, the allocation of budgets, time, and people, the willingness, this idea of what it means to fail fast becomes very, very clear. And employees and managers can see how that matters for the company strategy. If you don't have that clarity, it's just kind of chaotic, right? And more often than not, you also have a lot of anxiety in firms where the CEO might say, okay, everybody, we need to innovate. And then if there's no clarity about what that means or how that ladders up to your P&L, then people are just guessing. And
Yep.
Guesswork on top of guesswork creates a lot of risk aversion. And then suddenly, when you do your business practice survey, you hear things like, well, management doesn't tolerate innovation, or we're too risk averse. When really the problem is it just wasn't clear what innovation meant or why it matters. That's where the risk aversion can come from.
Right. And I think that definition of problem solving is exactly right. It's exactly right. And I've heard that, especially innovation professionals, like people from Spigot and other people who sort of like run innovation management software, innovation groups, et cetera. It's that simple, really. It's like, what's your outcome? And then what kind of innovative ways can we use to get to that outcome? But a lot of groups, they don't treat it like that. It's almost like it's innovation theater, right? It's like, hey, we're going to hire a chief innovation officer, and they're going to hire a huge team, and they're going to build all these things, and they're going to have a lab, and they're going to have cool stuff. And then nothing ever comes out of it product wise. I mean, have you seen that?
I have. And in fact, I have to say, Chris, I'm looking forward to your upcoming book. I don't know if it's out yet. I think the title is How Not to Innovate.
Soon.
And I think I remember somewhere in your description of the book, you say something about innovation theater. I think what you're striking at, and I'm not sure, most of what I've talked about on your podcast so far has been empirical. In other words, if you were to push hard at any of my assertions, I'd have some evidence. This next thing, let me just plant a flag where your listeners can see it. This is not empirical. This is just Peter's best guess. But my best guess on the origins of innovation theater of any kind finds its source all the way back at this bias against uncertainty that we talked about before, which is to say that if I'm an executive and I've worked pretty hard throughout my career to become one, chances are pretty good that I did this by applying the tools I learned in business schools in the 90s, right? Which is about, being very good at planning, being a good strategic thinker in the Porter's 5 forces sense of the word, maybe having an ROI mindset, constantly making decisions that would get me a return on capital greater than my cost of capital. And now I find myself in this world where, okay, welcome to the 2000s, 2010, I have this new batch of young executives working for me that have been trained in this thing called design thinking. Everywhere I look, I see articles about innovation, being innovative, the innovator's DNA, etc. So what am I to do? Well, I understand that there's something important going on that doesn't exactly map onto the way I run the business, the way I've always run the business. So I put it over here to the right.
Yeah,
I just put it
becomes
over
an ancillary thing.
to the right. There it is. And there's an innovation team and, skunk works, or a chief innovation officer, and my design thinking, my consultants on roller skates wishing through the room with brightly colored streamers flailing behind them. And the problem
No
is
segways, right? They're riding around with segways.
segways. Yeah, exactly. And you can see what the problem is with this. You're holding it somehow apart from the core strategy when it should simply be part of your where to play and how to compete choices. That's it. And that's the fundamental difference. And I think leaders can be forgiven for not naturally mapping it to their business, because for the most part, that's not how things were done. But that's where you need to go to. And until you do that, it does have a theatrical element to it.
Yeah,
And
no, you're 100% right. Because I think if we look at what people are being rewarded on, right? And people will always go to what they're rewarded on. So they're not rewarded to spend a lot of money trying to come up with something new that may fail miserably, right? They're rewarded on, the bottom line and meeting quotas, et cetera. It's almost like our whole reward system is not designed to drive innovation.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So I'm hearing you say that the incentives are not there, and that's certainly true. If your incentive, one way or the other, is to get an ROI on a project,
Yeah.
for example, there's a problem. There's a problem that emerges immediately, and it's not intuitive, but if you stick with the math for a little bit, you can see it. I mean, the two problems with ROI is, one, their point, the whole ROI math is its point estimates in time, right?
Yep.
And we all know that innovation is probabilistic, meaning there's a range of possible outcomes. And if you could know with any degree of certainty what that range is, well, it wouldn't be innovation anymore. You just execute.
Yep.
And that means that if you hold people accountable for ROI when they're innovating, they're naturally not going to be creative. Because if you say to me, Chris, okay, I want you to innovate, I'm going to be excited. But then you say to me, oh, we're going to hold you accountable for ROI. If I know anything about how ROI is calculated, I'm going to come up with the least creative, which is to say the most certain project I can come up with, and the one that's most likely to keep my CFO happy, and off I go. And it won't be particularly creative or disruptive. And the second problem with ROI, and this is one that I think even people in the finance community miss. ROI assumes that there's no penalty for not attempting what you're attempting. It basically says it's either zero or whatever your ROI is going to be. It doesn't actually.
$1 billion. That's what everyone asks for, right? They all want their own little unicorn.
Yeah. But imagine, to get an accurate ROI analysis, you also have to ask yourself, well, what's the potential downside if we don't attempt this at all, in terms of loss of competitive advantage, in terms of loss of customers, etc. So ROI doesn't permit this, and as a consequence, it is not a useful tool to use when you're innovating. And yet you still see it. At the end of I had a conversation last week where we were talking about an innovation initiative that we're about to engage in, which will be about a year long. And at the very end, somebody said, oh, okay, so at the end of 12 months, how are we going to measure the ROI on this? And my quick answer is, we won't. Certainly not if you want this to be successful and cause the appropriate mindset shift that you're looking for.
Did that kill the project when somebody said that, or did it? Is it?
No, 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 it didn't. It didn't. It led to a really interesting conversation. And Chris, I suspect that you and your listeners would all agree with the following statement. The thing that's most interesting about innovation is there's much of it that's counterintuitive, and there's a certain kind of magic that happens when your clients or your partners, or whoever they happen to be, bump up against to that moment of counter intuition, and then the light bulbs go off. It's it's the coolest thing. I mean, I think
You
it's
can actually see it happening. It's like a physical, almost a physical state change. It's really
amazing.
cool.
It's amazing. I mean, that I think is that's what makes consulting a lot of fun generally. And in the space of innovation and digital transformation, there's a lot more topspin that comes from that kind of joy, because there's just so much about this work that is either counterintuitive or that really runs in an opposite direction to what most people have learned great looks like when you're in business.
Oh, exactly right. I mean, one of the things I do is I work with companies to expand their patent portfolio. So you have to force yourself to come up with ideas that could not exist today. So like, let's go to 5 years out plus. And I remember in one meeting, I was describing that, and they kept sticking with product ideas, and I'm like, no, further, things that we can't do today. And he goes, oh, we're entering the land of make believe, and I said, yes.
So that's interesting. So you're in the business of helping. Or one of the things you're doing is helping companies expand their patent portfolio. Tell us, or if have you talked about this already on other podcasts?
Not really, but yeah. So basically, there's a set of companies, and I think some of these are in fintech as well, or not fintech, but financial services, where they've got a small portfolio of patents, or even zero portfolio patents, and they want to be able to have freedom to operate in different areas. And some fintech companies, obviously fintechs, they understand that they need to have IP protection for whatever they're doing, whereas some of the older financial services companies are like, we've been doing this forever, we've had a few patents, but we're okay. But so we work with them to sort of ideate in that space. Like, so maybe if there's an anchor patent, and then we sort of expand upon that, sort of build some more IP around it, or start from scratch. I mean, we've worked with startups who have an idea and they don't really know what to do with it. And then we sort of build a wall of protection around it. So as part of that, you've got to do ideation in that space sort of beyond where we are today. And it's really difficult to get SMEs to go beyond that, because it's almost like saying, forget everything, or go beyond, like, imagine something that you cannot do now. It's like saying, don't think about the white elephant, right? It's almost impossible for some people. But then when the light bulb clicks, it's like, oh yeah, you don't want something that we can do. You want something that we can't do. And then once you open up the possibilities of can't do, it's amazing what you can get out of them.
That's interesting. How would you say, if at all, innovating in the domain of patents is different from innovating in, say, the domain around products and services or supply chain?
It's totally different, because it really is, imagination. It frees you from all of the boundaries, because basically what happens is when people walk into our ideation sessions, it's like they've been sort of compressed by the problems of the day. Oh, how am I going to figure this out? How am I going to get ROI on this? How am I going to get this product out the door? All these different problems that I'm dealing with because of the systems that they're mired in today. And we just basically take that anchor away and say, you know what? Free your mind to think about, your ideal X. Right? Like, what would have to happen for this ideal X to occur? And then once you've imagined your ideal X's, then you kind of like unpack the black boxes and go, okay, how would we build that? How would we build that? How would we build that? And usually there's a huge gap between today and the thing that you want to build. So the patentability or the IP is in that space in between. So you can imagine this. And the concept is basically just, a lot of companies, they do IP at the end of the cycle. They go, okay, we have this product, we're about to release it to the world, and we want to make sure it's protected, right? But this is the opposite. This is, let's imagine a product that does not exist and we're not going to build, but we'll build a patent around it so that if we do decide to build it at some point in the future, then at least we have the protections. And if we decide not to, we can license it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like what you're doing is you're building IP protection around what's fundamentally a prototype.
Right, a prototype that does not exist.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's virtual product development, basically. It's a concept that I pioneered back at Yahoo in 2005 with a few other people. We had a VP of IP come in and say, you know what, our patent portfolio is way behind everybody else's. Look at Google, look at IBM, et cetera. So, but we need to build that out. And it's like, okay, well, how do we do that without actually building products? So we created this virtual product development process where we create products virtually that do not exist and then write IP around the product.
So let me ask you a question about this for your viewers who I'm guessing might be thinking this. One of the things we've observed that I think anyone who does innovation has felt is there's usually two sources of resistance to innovation of any kind. There's uncertainty related to the outcome, will this work or not? And then there's uncertainty related to the timing that happens. So, there's this base level of uncertainty is, will this idea take off or not relative to the cost associated with it? And then that uncertainty that gets amplified by the time scale over which you're doing this, right? So, if I were to go to my boss and say, okay, Jessica, I have this great idea, and I think, I need $100,000 or $10 million from you, and I think it might get you a return of X by next quarter. So immediately she's going to be thinking, well, here's the uncertainty of, will it be minus $1 million in profit or plus $1 million? And then when I say, oh, and by the way, we should reach steady state 5 years from now, it's just, oh, really? So so those are the kind of the two variables. My question for you is, do you find that when you're dealing with something like patents, by their very nature, does some of the resistance go down, perhaps on the timing knob? Because patents by their nature they tend to have much longer time scales? Or is you think, no, Pete, no resistance, no change at all? People are still as antsy about it as with anything else?
There's it's a different kind of pushback, because it's more along the lines of, well, what am I going to have at the end of this, right? What's coming out of this? And how can you, again, we're back to value. It's always ROI, value, et cetera. So if I come up with, say, 100 ideas or 50 ideas during a 2-hour session, and we go and we run it past the attorneys, and they go, well, 10 of these are patentable. So you have to decide, of these 10, which one of these is actually going to hit the jackpot? Which one is the $1 billion idea, and which one is a dud? There's no way to know. So what they do is we just patent all of them, because it's about 15 to 20K to do like a regular patent, about 1,500 to do a provisional. We just patent everything, right? So with $150,000, you've got 10 ideas that are protected, and you don't know which one of them is going to be $1 billion idea or not. So you just sort of capture it. So there's less risk in doing that, but at the same time, you have to convince people at the end of it is that this is something that's got some value. We just don't know what the value is yet, and that's even almost more uncertain in some ways, because they'll go, well, I spent $10 million on this, and I'm making $5 million on this, so I know exactly what my ROI is on this thing. But a patent, it's like, I've spent $15,000. Is it for nothing, or is it a $1 billion patent? We don't know.
The thing you said right in the middle of that that really stuck with me is you said, well, there are lots of different obstacles to innovation, or I think you said we have to rewind the tape, something to the effect of, the types of obstacles change when you're doing patent-related innovation to anything else. And the reason that stuck with me is I found that, isn't it funny that one of the defining characteristics of innovation is, if you want to get it right, you have to spend a disproportionate amount of your time focusing on the obstacles that get in the way, relative to any other endeavor.
Yeah.
You always need to do a form of stakeholder mapping and identifying obstacles for, I think, any business endeavor. But only with innovation does that become even more important than figuring out what the upside is,
Yeah.
or what the potential is, right?
Have you noticed this cycle? There's always this cycle, and I've done this for, I don't know, 15, 20 years now. And there's always this cycle of innovation within organizations, because organizations get super hot on it. They staff up, they hire, they do all these great things, or they talk about doing all these great things. And then there's a period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, when things are chugging along and it seems like there's action. But then there's a certain point in time where, again, maybe the market turns around, or there's some negative press or whatever, and then all of a sudden it's like, boom, gone, right? And then a couple of years later, it starts up again. So there's this, it's cyclical. And if you hit the company at the right moment, on the upswing, things are great, and they might actually go, even further, but it all comes down to leadership. If you have, someone in leadership who can champion this and move it through, then it's just going to keep on going. And then once you lose that champion, then at some point in the next couple of years or so, something serious is going to happen to this group. And I've seen it happen so many times. It's almost tiring. It's almost like Groundhog Day, right? It's like, oh, here we go again. We lost the CINO. Oh, okay. Well, what do you think this guy? Let's do some bets on how long this is going to last before the group disbands or whatever. But not every company has that problem. But I think the vast majority of companies that are not like non-tech probably fit into that space, because it's like the tech companies get it. They know that they need to continuously innovate in order to keep moving forward. Otherwise, they'll die. But almost every other industry is like, how far can we resist this? How far can we resist this? And you feel like it's obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. You spend all of your time, butting up against it. How do you get around it? So it's like, I mean, what have you found in places like, is there easier ways to get around it, or what are your thoughts?
So let me make sure I understand the question. It sounds like you're saying, have we found easy ways to get around a bias which says this will go away eventually? This is just an innovation cycle, and if I just hunker down and wait a little bit longer, things will go back to normal.
I don't know. You've seen the cycle, obviously, I'm assuming. You're nodding, so that's great. And then have you seen a situation where, what do you need to do to stop the cycle from dipping? Like, how do you, unless you see generate successful stuff and keep it going, then it'll dip again. So have you ever seen the ability to get out of the dip?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've certainly seen firms get out of the dip, and usually the reason for them doing that is no surprise, some sense of urgency, right? And I think that's what we're talking about, the cyclical nature of this. It's for whatever reason, depending on the firm you're working with, there's a natural entropy, or a cultural inertia that says, if it isn't broke, don't fix it, right? And you're in that kind of situation if you have a certain layer of the organization that's quite happy with their profits and their bonuses and how things are going, and there's maybe some bubbling agitation at the bottom, or at different parts of the company where they say, we need to innovate, if for no other reason than because it's exciting and because we want to try new things. And then ultimately, where the suppressed entrepreneurial energy breaks through to the top is some exogenous shock. A competitor comes in, there's a market shift, and now all of a sudden everybody's aligned. So I think never waste a good crisis. You're guaranteed to have that problem solved for you if your competitors force you to do it.
Right.
I think maybe the more interesting question you're asking is, have we seen examples where that happens before there's a crisis? And the answer is yes. And it usually starts with leaders who are effective at thinking from the future back. Right? No more or less complicated than that. They arrive at a company that's doing very well, or they arrive at a situation that's great, and they have their team extend their imagination 3 to 5 years into the future and ask, what does this world look like? And is there anything going on here that we should start planning for today? And that's where you get companies to start thinking about innovating and being future forward long before they need to. So by the time you actually get there, innovation, it isn't something we need to start to do. It's what we've been doing for ages, and it becomes a natural part of their DNA.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think, we should have like a chief futurist officer or something like that, like somebody in leadership who does look out 10 years or so and go, okay, here's where we're going to be in 10 years. Let's work backwards from that 10-year mark to today, and then figure out where we're going to go and build that ourselves. Right. Because a lot of these companies go, well, I can't possibly think that far out. And it's like, well, you have a hand in getting to that point. Right. It's not just, you're not just being buffeted by the world. You have a hand in getting there. And if you don't know, at least how you're going to get there, at least have a plan to get there, then how are you going to know what to do next? I mean, it's maybe it's like a bias towards short-term thinking. There's so much short-term thinking that it's almost impossible to get that long view.
Yeah, it's a good point. I would say that smart people, in fact, in particular, smart people, often have a difficult time imagining the future. And it's not because of a lack of smarts, it's typically because they have a difficult time seeing beyond their current frame of reference, right? Or because they have a difficult time getting their heads around fiction. Even if it's plausible fictions, it's just there's a counter.
Science fiction is plausible. No.
Yeah, I see that with the Starship Enterprise over your left shoulder there. But it's an important point. One of my favorite stories whenever clients push back on this is they say, well, tell me, that sounds great in the abstract. What does it look like in the real world? And there's a company we work with, multinational, that does a lot of business in mainland China, and their head of that part of the world does something really interesting. Every month, every week actually, there's a senior leadership team where all of the regional heads get together, and they simply talk about what's going on that week, right? So it's very action-oriented, very immediate term focused. But 1 week a month when they get together, they only talk about 3 years out. And what's fascinating, if you go to the weekly stand-up meeting, there's no discussion of the future is permitted. There's no fantastical conversations. It's save it for the 3-year meeting. But then when you get to the 3-year meeting, it doesn't matter. I mean, the local channel could be on fire. This is a session where we only talk about the future. Yeah. And talking with this leader about how he created this rhythm, it was very disruptive at first, but gradually what happened is he created a cadre of leaders who just have a natural habit for keeping their feet in 2 places at once, scaling today's business model on 1 foot while always looking 3 to 5 years out on the other. And after 1.5 years of this, it has fundamentally changed their results over there.
No, I love it. That's a fantastic idea. So it kind of leads back to a culture, right? I mean, I think a lot of this is because of culture change. That's how you get innovation to move forward within an organization. Has that been able to change that concept? Has that been changed? Has it changed culture throughout, or is that just a leadership thing?
You can imagine. I mean, we haven't done a cultural audit there, but we have done a business practice survey, and no surprise, I mean, literally right down to the front line, what we're seeing is people saying things, for example, on a scale, to what extent does management support innovation? It has gone up. To what extent is creativity encouraged in the business? That has gone up. That's not the only thing that they're doing, but you can imagine, right? Just, you can extend your imagination into a world where if you have the top X number of people acting this way, it's going to trickle down to the day-to-day conversations, and it's going to at least impact how people view the world and the types of conversations they have subsequently.
No, that's a fantastic, if you think about it, I mean, that could be triggering a whole series of events that takes it, that expands and you finding this company being more innovative than usual?
Well, that's an interesting question, because this is one of those firms, honestly, where I sometimes feel like I learn more from them than they get from us. And I say that all the time. You know, it's just funny when we were first approached to do innovation work with them. Honestly, I'm pretty sure I said this in the first sales meeting. I said, "Really? You, I mean, I'm not sure we have anything to teach you that you don't already know." And actually, I have to say to her credit, the client fired back. She's like, "Yeah, Pete, you know, that's sweet of you to say, fine, but if you don't think there's always an opportunity to get better at this stuff, then just keep your fingers crossed and hope the competition feels the same way." I was like,
Right.
all right, all right, giddy up, we'll do what we can. So it's, I realized I didn't answer your question. It was always a very creative company. I would say that they saw opportunities in this particular region to get even better. So future back thinking, you know, this sort of behavior and this set of processes and tools was one of the things that we brought to the table that they hadn't been doing. So I hope it's had an impact. I mean, it certainly seems to have had an impact across some of the measures we were accountable for.
Fantastic. So let's talk about digital transformation for a couple of minutes. So what's your definition of digital transformation?
So cut through the consultant jargon, says.
Because you know everybody has a different one. It's just like innovation. It's one of those things that are just.
Honestly, I sometimes wonder. I had beautiful long hair before I was asked to take on the
That's what my wife tells me too.
and digital transformation practice. Well, because there's the two jargony expressions wrapped into one practice. But I think you can imagine, given what we talked about earlier, our definition, we said it earlier, it's a set of principles, procedures, and tools, right? Which is consultant speak for. It's a mindset and a skill set for discovering and solving problems in new ways using technology. I said it's discovering and solving problems in new ways using technology. And I would say the thing in that, at least for me, that I find is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, is how digital transformation is different than digitalization. And what I mean by this very specifically is, to our way of thinking, digitalization is merely taking what you've always done in the analog world and digitizing it. So going from live meetings to Teams meetings, going from doing things on a whiteboard to Miro, right?
Yeah.
Digital transformation is different. Digital transformation is fundamentally reimagining how you get outcomes using the miracles of digital technology.
Yep.
And when you make that shift from digitalization to digital transformation, a couple of things happen. First, you have to make that shift from planning and waiting to testing and learning, we talked about. Experimentation mindset is required. Two, you have to be comfortable with uncertainty.
Yep.
And it's such a jargony, pop trendy thing to say that I almost don't want to say it, but practically speaking, it means equipping leaders with the tools and the confidence they need to do one simple thing. And that simple thing is this: you have to be able to say, I don't know, and move forward without putting your team, your reputation, or your P&L at risk. That's it. That's what lay at the core of disciplined experimentation, or agile, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. It's about equipping people to say, I don't know, and move forward.
Giving them the license to do it.
Yeah. When you say a license, you're talking about create a zone of psychological safety, or create an environment where fast and quick failure is tolerated. Yes to all of that, and at bottom, it comes down to a set of behaviors. I mean, it literally, Chris, comes down to helping people recognize what they need to start, stop, and do more of. Coming down to what do I need to start, stop, and do more of? This is the thing that's often missed, I find, whenever anyone talks about agile or or innovation or design thinking. It's okay, I kind of get it. I can read the book. In fact, any consultant who is intellectually honest will say that most of these ideas have been around for a very long time. And it goes back to the 50s and Alex Osborne. The problem is in getting them used. And to get them used, it's getting leaders to practice and internalize what I need to start, stop, and do more of. Once you can do that, you've taken the mystery and the misery out of all of this. But before you do that, you're leaving leaders adrift to kind of figure out how to do this stuff. And it doesn't feel good most of the time because, we're full circle again, because of the uncertainty associated with it. It's, whenever I hear someone say, younger executives come to me and they say, well, the problem is my boss isn't innovative enough, or she's risk averse. All I say is, she's a human being with a brain and 2,000 years of uncooperative genetic programming that has just made us all naturally wired to avoid uncertainty. And then add 10 years or 15 years of business training or engineering training that is all oriented towards stripping uncertainty out of work and then getting promoted for doing that. Now you've got a recipe for someone who's it's less about them being uninnovative to being more about oriented towards avoiding risk at all costs. And therein lies the problem. And of course, from there, you can extract the solution as well.
Yeah, actually, so we've been engineered to be risk averse, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know who it was who said this. So my apologies to whoever you are out there whose story I'm taking. I'm sure I saw it on a conference somewhere. Someone made the point, here's the easiest way to think about it. If you're walking down the street at night on a dimly lit street and there's a rustling in the bushes, your instinct is going to be to jump away and be like, ah. Whereas if you're a lion is walking down the street and there's a rustling in the bushes, her instinct will be to pounce and attack. And basically, that's just evolutionary biology at work.
So we need to pounce and attack, it sounds like to me.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's perhaps it's an oversimplification. My apologies to cultural anthropologists out there. But yeah, if your instinct is to avoid uncertainty at all costs, then it's no surprise you're going to be reluctant to engage in innovation or anything that has a high degree of uncertainty associated.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible to avoid uncertainty, but embracing it is probably the best solution. But not many of us can actually do that. Yeah.
Well, and the thing is, it's not easy, but it can be done. And of course, that's the space we find ourselves in. And coming full circle to the start of our interview, when you asked, well, what do you do and what your passions are? There it is. So, innovation, digital transformation is the moniker, but really what we're talking about is at the level of the brain, really even people's brains figuring out what creativity is, how does it work, and how can we use it to see uncertainty, not as something to be avoided, but actually as a source of growth, excitement, inspiration, and practically speaking, profitability for our businesses as we charge forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, time to think like a futurist. Where are you going to be? Where are things going to be in 2031, 10 years out?
So let me pull out my crystal ball. Where are things going to be? Well, there's a big difference between
10 years.
20 years and 30 years.
2031.
So by 2031, where are things going to be? I don't know.
I love it. That's the first time anyone's ever said that.
I don't know, but I can tell you, I could tell you how you could figure it out for yourself. Would that be interesting?
Okay.
What I would recommend, the way I would answer that question, I mean, the way we approach the question oftentimes is I would simply take signals, right? There's another consulting expression. If you ever hear signals of the future, it's basically take examples of the future that you see in the present. Right?
Yep.
Examples
That's part of it. Yep.
I would line them all up on the wall, right on the beautiful wall. I notice, by the way, Chris, we share the same taste in wallpaper color. By the way, we can talk
Paint
about
color,
that
yeah.
later. Yeah, wallpaper color. I would take the different signals you see, and I would munge them together, which is a fancy way of saying, take seemingly unrelated signals, put them next to each other and ask, what are some of the surprising ways in which these things interact with each other? And then you can say interesting things like, well, this is a future in which blank is likely to happen. And for me at the moment, honestly, the thought about what the world's going to look like at 2031 is a bit overwhelming. As a father, in particular, I'm trying to anticipate, what's the world going to look like, and how do I prepare my children for that? And I would say the signals that are most interesting are artificial intelligence in general. I would encourage everyone to understand that and take the mystery and the misery out of it. Spoiler alert, it's math. It's just statistics meets
When you say that, some people run away from it. It's like a 4-letter word, right?
Including my son. Yeah, but that's it. That's the whole thing. I would look at artificial intelligence, and I would look specifically, Chris, at do-it-yourself artificial intelligence. I would look at that as one signal. The next signal I would look at is, of course, distributed teams and hybrid work environments. And then the third one I would take together is privacy and cybersecurity. I would start there. I mean, there's a lot more we could add, but I think if you add those three things together, they're going to create some future states that I think are going to be highly, I don't know what they are, but I have a high degree of confidence that those three things are going to munge together in ways that are going to change all of our lives.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way? LinkedIn, webpage?
Yeah, you could come to, thank you for the question, by the way. So you could come to LinkedIn, that would be lovely. Or you can go directly to bts.com, BravoTangoSally.com, and you can find me there, and you can find our whole team there, actually. Awesome. And we would love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It was great talking with you. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.